3 graves, not in the master's cemetery, nor in the shade of any churchyard, but in the very soil they had watered with sweat and tears. 3 men buried alive, their necks protruding from the ground like grotesque monuments around a seething ant mound beneath the Louisiana Sunday. This is not a tale about monsters of legend. It is about the monstrosity men inflict upon one another and the silent justice born in hearts too long trampled. If you are the kind of person who believes the most important stories are not the ones written in textbooks but the ones whispered in the dark, carried from mouth to mouth so they might survive the winds of time, then you are in the right place. Settle in. The story that follows is one few dared speak aloud, yet it lived, clinging to the edges of memory like ivy on crumbling stone. The year was 1854. Dawn crept across a Louisiana plantation, gilding the endless cotton rows in pale gold. Ordinarily, morning broke with a clamor, the overseer's whistle, the clang of the bell, the groan of weary bodies pulled from fitful sleep. Yet this morning, silence pressed upon the fields like fog. Something was amiss, and every soul felt it. The unease began with absence. 3 men, Silas, Thomas, and Ezekiel, the overseers whose very names conjured dread, did not appear at roll call. At first, their absence drew puzzled frowns from fellow foremen. By the time word reached the master's house, that puzzlement had hardened into alarm. A search was ordered with the same brusque urgency one might dispatch hounds for missing livestock. Horses thundered through the rows, lodgings were ransacked, lanterns bobbed in the pre-dawn gloom. Yet not a trace was found. No footprints, no broken latch, no discarded coat. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed the 3 men whole. Among the whites, fear swelled like an oncoming storm. If such men armed, cruel, dreaded by all could vanish, then no one was safe. But in the slave quarters, whispers took another shape. Behind lowered eyes and murmured prayers, a different tale stirred, a story of dark justice, of vengeance long in the making. Someone, or something, had dared to answer cruelty with cruelty. The rumor drifted from shack to shack, carried by hot wind and hushed voices. It was a tale too dangerous to voice in daylight, yet too thrilling to silence. Who could have done it? Who possessed the strength or the courage to challenge the demons of the plantation? No one said a word. But inside, men and women felt something stirring they had not felt in years. Hope. Not a bright, naive hope, but a dangerous ember smoldering in ash. The overseer's absence unsettled more than routine. Their tyranny had been the plantation's heartbeat, its daily rhythm of pain and control. Without them, order itself seemed brittle. The master's voice barked sharper, his eyes darted quicker, as if the void left by his 3 enforcers were an open wound. Yet for those whose lives had been chained by fear, the silence of that morning was heavy with possibility. Every snap of twig, every distant call of a crow seemed to echo a single question: had justice finally come? To understand the weight of that question, you must picture the world of that plantation, a self-contained kingdom of cruelty. Imagine row upon row of cotton under the brutal sun, a green sea without horizon. The soundscape was not birdsong or laughter, but the unceasing rasp of labor hands tearing open sharp cotton bolls until fingers bled, the whip's crack slicing the air like lightning, followed by the muffled sob of a body breaking under its sting. The air smelled of sweat, of damp earth, and of despair. Here, law was not written in books. Law was the master's whim, enforced by the overseers. To the enslaved, the overseers were more than men. They were the angels of punishment in a perverse religion where suffering was liturgy. Silas's whip taught obedience, Thomas's iron carved ownership into flesh. Ezekiel's grave smothered dreams of escape before they could sprout. These men embodied terror itself, and terror was the mortar that kept the entire edifice of slavery intact. It was this terror that made their disappearance unthinkable and thus electrifying. A tremor ran through both worlds, the ruling and the ruled. For the master, it was dread of disorder. For the enslaved, it was the first hint, however faint, that the fortress of cruelty had a crack. Picture that dawn. The big house looming with its white columns and broad veranda, shutters flung open to a restless master pacing inside. The fields stretching beyond, dotted with the stooped figures of men and women already pressed into labor, though their minds were elsewhere. And in the quarters, the whispers swelling, fed by both fear and awe. Stories like this are fragile. They begin in the smallest breath, passed from one laborer to another. They grow stronger in the shadows, nourished by silence, until they stand unshakable, rooted deeper than truth itself. This was one of those stories, the story of 3 men who disappeared, and of the woman whose silent fury set it all in motion. Her name was Penelope, but before we follow her footsteps, before we uncover the plan she wove from patience and pain, we must linger in that moment of absence. That strange, unsettling dawn when 3 tyrants failed to appear and the entire plantation, from the grand parlor to the smallest shack, felt the balance shift. The whites feared the unknown. The enslaved clung to the possibility that the earth had, at last, swallowed its worst tormentors. No one dared to voice it aloud, yet the silence itself carried meaning. It was the sound of a story about to be born. This story, to comprehend the weight of those vanished overseers, you must see clearly the world they ruled, a world some called the Cotton Kingdom, though its throne was carved from suffering. The plantation was not only land, it was a machine of terror, built to grind bodies into profit, sustained by fear as much as by labor. Imagine 2 structures that defined the horizon, the big house and the quarters. The first, proud and gleaming, rose with ostentatious white columns and a veranda broad enough for idle laughter, bourbon glasses, and cigars. To visitors it symbolized refinement, culture, wealth. But its foundation was rot, for every plank and brick was soaked in the blood and toil of the enslaved. The quarters were the other half of that universe. Crooked rows of wooden shacks with dirt floors, no glass in the windows, and roofs that leaked rain in summer and let in frost in winter. Inside, families crammed into spaces so tight they barely stretched their legs at night. Hunger gnawed constantly, not just at bellies but at the spirit, for food rations were meager, and freedom from pain even rarer. Each dawn, the bells toll did not announce a new day but a continuation of the same nightmare. Work began before the sun, before the birds had shaken the dew from their wings. Men, women, even children shuffled into the fields where cotton plants stood like endless rows of prison bars. Fingers grew raw from plucking the sharp boles, spines bent until they ached as if they would snap. The quota set each day was impossible by design, a cruel trick that ensured punishment would always follow. And punishment was not a hidden thing. It was the language of the place. Whips cracked not only across backs but across the air, carrying a message to every ear. Defiance will be crushed. To the enslaved, every shriek, every lash was a public sermon preached in blood. The overseers were the preachers of this grim gospel, and each man had his specialty. Silas, called the whip, believed pain was a teacher. His whip was an extension of his body, coiled leather alive in his hands. He could slice through the fabric of a shirt and leave skin unbroken, or he could cut so deep that flesh turned to ribbons. Sometimes, when dusk painted the fields red, Penelope would glimpse him returning from his rounds with stains darkening his trousers, not mud, something darker. His pale eyes gleamed with satisfaction whenever he drew a cry that echoed across the rows. Thomas, the brand, had none of Silas's heat. His cruelty was cold, methodical, a ledger balanced in flesh. He kept the records, births, deaths, escapes as if men and women were cattle. His branding iron, always glowing at the edge of a fire, carried a mark he pressed into runaways, thieves, and sometimes simply the disobedient. The smell of burnt skin lingered long after the act, a stench that haunted the quarters at night. He did not shout or curse. He simply pressed the iron and watched, impassive, as pain seared its way into memory. Then there was Ezekiel, the most feared, thin, spectral. His hollow eyes stared as though he lived half in this world and half in some darker place. He rarely spoke, but his method was terror itself. Ezekiel did not beat or brand. He buried. Men whispered of being lowered alive into shallow pits, soil packed tight around their chests, the air growing thin, the earth itself becoming a coffin. Some clawed free, leaving the ground littered with desperate fingernail marks. Others never returned. The threat alone was enough to keep many in chains, long before shackles touched their wrists. Together, these men formed a trinity of torment, body, mark, and grave. They were not merely overseers, they were the machinery of obedience. Their absence was therefore more than a gap in routine, it was an earthquake. For the enslaved, existence was a fragile balance of submission and survival. A single word, a glance too bold, could summon Silas's whip. A failed quota could bring Thomas's iron. A whispered dream of freedom might end in Ezekiel's grave. Hope itself was dangerous. Children grew up knowing that to speak of escape was to invite death, and so they swallowed their longing until it burned like acid inside them. This was the cotton hell, a place where time itself felt circular days repeating in endless loops of toil and punishment. The future stretched out like the rows of plants, each stalk identical, each day blending into the next. The past was a painful ghost, songs in lost languages, rivers from homelands forgotten, stories fading into silence. And the present was simply survival. One breath, one handful of cotton, one night endured in order to see the next dawn. Punishment did not always wait for defiance. Sometimes it was spectacle for its own sake, cruelty paraded like theater. The master himself often sat on his veranda, glass in hand, while an overseer lashed a man in the yard before the gathered quarters. The point was not discipline, it was domination, proof that no one was safe, that obedience was the only shield, though even that shield cracked often. The enslaved whispered among themselves that the overseers were demons rather than men. Yet demons they were forced to serve food, to obey, to endure. The quarters echoed each night with the hushed retelling of punishments endured, and the sighs of exhaustion from those too weary to speak. The lash, the brand, the grave, these were not isolated tools, but the grammar of terror. And so when Silas, Thomas, and Ezekiel vanished, the silence of their absence was louder than their whips had ever been. For the first time, the machine faltered. The plantation felt the tremor of possibility. Could demons bleed? Could cruelty itself be toppled? What no one yet realized, not the master pacing his veranda, not the other overseers clutching rifles in nervous patrol, not the weary laborers bending over their sacks of cotton, was that the answer to those questions would come not from some outside force, but from within their own world. From the quiet eyes of a woman who moved like a shadow through the big house, carrying trays, folding linens, listening. Her name, whispered seldom and remembered long, was Penelope. To the master and his guests, she was almost invisible. Penelope glided through the big house like a shadow cast by candlelight present, yet never acknowledged. She poured wine, cleared dishes, smoothed linens, and fetched whatever whim struck her owners. Her eyes rarely lifted. Her voice, when it sounded at all, was clipped to a single "yes, sir," or "yes, ma'am." But invisibility can be a shield. And behind it, Penelope's mind worked with a precision sharpened by years of pain. Every whispered conversation that floated across polished mahogany tables, every careless boast muttered over brandy, every set of keys rattled carelessly at a belt, she stored it all away. If memory were a ledger, hers was meticulous, balanced with perfect entries. She had not been born to this house. Her earliest memories were of a wide river and songs in a tongue her lips no longer remembered how to form. Torn away as a child, she had passed through auction blocks and hands until she landed here, in the service of the master's family. Her small size and quickness had spared her the fields, but it had not spared her from cruelty. Instead, it placed her at the very center of it, in the big house, the glittering shell that hid the rot. To outsiders, domestic duty might have seemed a softer fate, but in truth, it was another kind of cage. In the fields, pain came from the sun and the whip. In the big house, it came from proximity to power, from the constant reminder that she was less than human in the eyes of those who leaned on her labor. She carried trays heavy with meats and wine, though her own meals were little more than cornbread and salted scraps. She polished silverware engraved with family crests, though her own bed was straw stuffed in a corner cubicle. She overheard masters and mistresses mock the very people who addressed them that morning, as though cruelty were a parlor game. But Penelope was no passive witness. She watched, she listened, and she remembered. Her eyes were lowered, but her mind was never still. She observed the rhythms of the household, the way Silas swaggered back at dusk, reeking of sweat and blood, the way Thomas meticulously cleaned his branding iron by the fire, the way Ezekiel stared too long at her with a gaze that made her skin crawl. She mapped these movements as a scholar might diagram a text, looking for weak points. She knew which wines were favored, at which meals, which guests spilled secrets when they drank too much bourbon, which keys hung on which hooks. She learned to read the expressions of the mistress, who smiled sweetly to visitors, yet hissed with venom at the enslaved servants once the doors were closed. She learned to judge, by the master's tone, when a joke would turn to cruelty, when the laughter of white men was the prelude to a night of terror for someone in the quarters. Her position gave her access denied to others. She could linger near the parlor door, her head bowed as though waiting for an order, while in truth she was cataloguing every detail of plantation business. She overheard talk of cotton prices in New Orleans, the shifting of state laws, rumors of abolitionist pamphlets circulating upriver. She heard, too, the laughter of overseers boasting of punishments as if recounting hunting trophies. All of it entered her mind's vault. The enslaved in the quarters knew little of what she knew. They saw her carrying trays, and perhaps they envied what seemed like an easier post. But Penelope bore another kind of burden, the burden of knowledge. Every cruel jest, every detail of profit and pain, every whispered conversation between men who saw themselves as gods, she absorbed it all. It was a double life. Outwardly, she was the perfect servant. Inwardly, she was a chronicler, storing the very fuel that one day would ignite. Her submission was the mask. Her sharpness, her patience, her memory, these were the hidden weapons. And yet, for all her calm, she was not immune to the daily humiliations of proximity. Silas would seize her wrist to issue commands, his grip so tight it left bruises. Thomas regarded her clinically, as if she were a horse to be measured and valued. Ezekiel's silence was worse. His hollow eyes bored into her until she felt as though he were already digging her grave. Every encounter was a small death, endured in silence. Still, she endured. What choice was there? In a world where open defiance meant certain destruction, survival demanded patience, and patience was something Penelope possessed in abundance. There were small rebellions, invisible to her masters but vital to her spirit. She hummed, softly, snatches of melodies she barely remembered from childhood, songs that reminded her she came from a people who once had names, not prices. She tended to herbs in hidden corners, not only to heal fevers but to remind herself that knowledge survived chains. She carried stories in her mind, passed down in whispers from older women in the quarters, fragments of a culture her captors tried to erase. These were not weapons yet, but they were sparks, waiting. To the master, she was a servant. To the mistress, a convenient shadow. To the overseers, an object to be ordered about, perhaps worse. To herself, she was something else entirely, a witness. And a witness does not forget. The years of observation had taught her the most important lesson: those who seem most untouchable are often the most careless. Silas trusted his whip too much. Thomas trusted his records. Ezekiel trusted fear itself. And the master trusted all three of them. Penelope filed it away, each weakness like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. On the surface, nothing suggested that she would be the one to unravel them. She bowed when spoken to. She moved silently through the house. She never raised her voice. But under the mask of obedience, her mind worked ceaselessly. Every slight, every bruise, every whispered cruelty poured into a reservoir inside her, and reservoirs, when full, must one day burst. It had not yet happened, but the ground was shifting, though no one but Penelope sensed it. She carried her trays, she swept the floors, she listened, and in her silence, the storm gathered. Soon, the mask of invisibility would become the perfect cover for something far greater. There are moments in history when a single night divides a life into two halves, what came before and what must come after. For Penelope, that night arrived without warning. She had extinguished the last candles in the big house, her body weary but her mind, as always, quietly vigilant. The halls were silent, the polished floors gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She stepped out onto the back porch, the air heavy with summer heat, when shadows detached themselves from the darkness. They were not there to issue orders, not there to punish some imagined infraction. No, the three overseers had found her alone, unguarded, and they chose to assert power in the most brutal way possible. What followed cannot and should not be described in detail, for to dwell on cruelty is to grant it a kind of victory. But it was an act of violence against her body and her spirit, an attempt to erase not only her dignity, but her very sense of self. When at last they left her discarded on the cold boards like refuse, Penelope did not crumble. She did not weep aloud. Something inside her had shifted. It was not brokenness, but transformation. Where others might have found only despair, she found something harder than steel, a purpose. She rose, her clothes torn, her body aching. She walked back to her small cubicle behind the kitchen. Every step was deliberate, measured, as though she were walking across a threshold into a new existence. She lay awake through the long hours until dawn, not crying, not trembling, but staring into the dark with eyes that no longer looked down. They looked forward. That night ended her resignation. In its place grew resolve, not a hot, reckless thirst for revenge that would burn quickly and be extinguished by punishment, but a cold, patient fire. The kind of fire that smolders unseen until the moment is right to consume everything in its path. For days afterward, she carried on as if nothing had happened. She served the master's wine, polished the silver, straightened the mistress's gowns. To any observer, she was the same silent, efficient house servant she had always been. But within, a new rhythm pulsed. Every task was performed with the steadiness of someone conserving energy for something greater. Every glance was sharper, every memory etched deeper. The overseers, emboldened by their crime, believed they had reinforced their dominance. They mistook her silence for submission, but silence can be more dangerous than screams. It can be the still surface of a river concealing a deadly current beneath. For Penelope, the current began to flow toward a single conclusion. They must pay. Not with a sudden knife in the dark, not with a futile rebellion that would bring ruin to her people. No, their punishment must fit their crimes. It must mirror the fear they had sown. It must speak in a language everyone understood, the language of terror. Her plan did not spring forth in an instant. It grew slowly, carefully, like a seed watered with hatred and patience. She began by watching them more closely than ever, mapping their routines with almost scientific precision. When did Silas leave his whip behind? How long did Thomas linger by his records before joining the others? At what hour did Ezekiel take his solitary patrol through the fields? Patterns emerged, clear as constellations. At the same time, her mind turned toward memory lessons whispered long ago by her grandmother, who had been brought from Africa in chains but carried with her an ancestral knowledge of roots and herbs. Penelope recalled the stories murmured in the dark. Leaves that cooled fevers, bark that numbed pain, seeds that lulled a person into heavy sleep. She had listened as a child, not knowing that one day these whispers would become weapons. The law offered no justice. A complaint against overseers would be met with laughter, perhaps worse. Appeals to sympathy would be crushed. In this world, the only justice possible was the one a person forged with her own hands, and so Penelope began to forge. Each night, after the house had gone still, she replayed the events of that terrible evening in her mind. But she did not allow the memory to paralyze her. She transformed it, turned it into fuel. Every bruise became a reason. Every cruel laugh became a spark. Every whispered threat became another stone in the foundation of her plan. She no longer thought of herself as powerless. She thought of herself as patient. She was no longer simply enduring. She was preparing. In this, history offers us a cruel clarity. Countless enslaved women endured similar violence. Their suffering erased from records, their names lost to time. Most had no opportunity, no margin of safety to strike back. That Penelope did is extraordinary, but her fury was not unusual. It was the shared fury of generations, distilled in one woman's heart until it became unbreakable. So she donned her mask more perfectly than ever. To the master and mistress, she was still the dutiful servant. To the overseers, she was still the silent shadow. Yet inside her, a volcano simmered, its eruption inevitable. She knew what the others did not. Every empire of cruelty has a weakness. Every tyrant has a blind spot. Theirs was arrogance. They believed themselves untouchable, feared by all, masters of fate. But arrogance breeds carelessness, and Penelope, who noticed everything, was waiting. The breaking point had come and gone. Now there was only the path forward. Her life had been split in two, and the second half belonged not to submission, but to vengeance. The plan took shape not in haste, but in silence. Penelope carried it in her mind the way a craftsman carries the design of a hidden masterpiece, refining it in secret until each line is flawless. She could not afford mistakes. One misstep, one suspicious glance, and her life would be crushed under the heel of the system she served. Observation was her first weapon. She had always noticed details, but now she watched with the precision of a hunter. The overseers were not as vigilant as they believed themselves to be. Arrogance dulled their senses. Their nightly ritual was the thread she tugged at. Every evening, after their rounds of terror through the fields, Silas, Thomas, and Ezekiel gathered in their quarters, a rough wooden shack set apart from the big house. There they drank, not fine bourbon, but cheap whiskey that burned the throat. They told stories of cruelty, laughing at broken bodies, boasting of punishments as though they were triumphs. They grew careless with each swallow, their laughter louder, their guards lowered. It was their ritual of brotherhood, their communion of power. To Penelope, watching from the shadows outside, the bottle was no mere bottle. It was a weakness, a portal into vulnerability. It was their Achilles heel, and she would strike through it. But she needed more than opportunity. She needed a tool. Her mind reached back to childhood, whispers her grandmother's voice in the darkness of the quarters, teaching her the hidden knowledge of plants. The master saw only cotton and weeds, but to those who still remembered, the land was a pharmacy and an arsenal. There was one vine, growing far from the neat rows of cotton, at the edge of the forest. Its flowers were unremarkable, small and pale, but its roots, crushed into paste, yielded a substance that could plunge even the strongest body into heavy, dreamless sleep. Not death that would have been too sudden, too suspicious, but deep unconsciousness, long enough for her to act, long enough for her vengeance. The days that followed were a quiet fever of preparation. Each chance she had, Penelope slipped away to the forest's edge, her heart pounding with the risk of discovery. She dug her fingers into the damp earth, prying loose the knotted roots, hiding them in folds of cloth or at the bottom of water buckets. Her hands, skilled in folding linens and polishing silver, now became hands of a gatherer, drawing power from the soil itself. At night, alone in her cubicle, she worked by touch. She crushed the roots with a small, worn mortar, releasing a bitter, milky liquid. The smell was sharp, earthy, clinging to her skin. She turned her face away from the vapors, knowing even the preparation was dangerous. Every sound was muffled, every movement deliberate. She was utterly alone. One curious glance from another servant, one accident, would mean discovery and certain death. Still, she pressed on. Each night the small clay flask filled a little more with the sleeping draught. Each night her resolve hardened. She was not acting in impulse. She was building inevitability. The bottle was the final obstacle. It was kept in a locked cabinet in the overseer's shack, but Penelope had seen enough of keys jangling to know their patterns. She fashioned a slender wire, thin enough to probe the lock. She rehearsed in her mind every motion, approach, entry, poison, retreat until it was muscle memory. The chosen night came cloaked in perfect darkness. The sky was starless, the moon hidden. She crouched in the shadow of an oak, her clay flask pressed against her side, her breath shallow. Her body was still, but inside her, her heart beat like a drum. As she had predicted, Ezekiel left first for his patrol, slipping into the fields with his lantern. Minutes later, Silas and Thomas strode off together toward the stables. The shack door remained ajar, unlocked in their carelessness. Now, Penelope moved like a ghost, crossing the open ground in swift silence. Inside, the shack smelled of sweat, tobacco, and liquor. The cabinet loomed. Her hands did not tremble as she slid the wire into the lock. A soft click. The door swung open. The whiskey bottle gleamed faintly in the dim light, half full of amber liquid. She uncorked it, poured the contents of her flask into its depths. The liquid turned cloudy for an instant before blending. She shook the bottle gently, returned it to its place, closed the cabinet, and relocked it. Every movement was precise, rehearsed, final. Then she was gone, back into the night, pressing herself against the oak's rough bark, her pulse still pounding in her ears. She waited. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, through the darkness, she saw them return. First Ezekiel, then Silas and Thomas, their voices loud with drink. She heard the clink of the bottle, the gurgle of liquid into glasses, the thud of boots against the floor. Their laughter rolled out, then softened, then slurred. A pause, and then the silence. Penelope waited longer still, every heartbeat a measure of caution. Finally, she dared to peer through a crack in the window. There they were. Silas sprawled across the table, his arm dangling limp. Thomas slumped in his chair, his chin on his chest. Ezekiel sprawled on the floor, his lantern tipped and guttering. The bottle lay nearly empty on the table, its amber contents replaced by a poison brewed from roots and memory. The plan's first step was complete. They were not dead, but helpless 3 men reduced to breathing husks, their cruelty stilled by her grandmother's wisdom. A great stillness settled over her, not peace, but the silence of a predator about to strike. The time for patience had ended, the time for vengeance had come. The night was still young, she had work to do. The shack was quiet, save for the rasping breath of 3 drugged men. Penelope lingered in the shadows, her body taut with fear and anticipation. The potion had worked too perfectly, almost. Silas's arm dangled from the table, limp as a rag. Thomas's head lolled forward, drool glistening at his chin. Ezekiel lay sprawled on the floor, eyes rolled back, lips parted in a shallow snore. But if the first phase had been victory, the second demanded even greater courage. She had to move them, shift these hulking bodies through darkness without rousing suspicion, without leaving a trace of her presence. Her first step was to erase what she had touched. Inside the shack, she wiped the cabinet, the bottle, the glasses, every surface her fingers had brushed. A damp cloth worked in hurried circles, removing smudges, stray drops, evidence that anyone but the overseers themselves had been there. She picked up the small clay flask that had held the poison and tucked it deep within her garments. The shack now looked as it always did, disordered by drink, not intrusion. Then came the hardest part. Silas was first. Heavy-set, broad-shouldered, his body sagged like dead weight. Penelope dragged a coarse blanket from a corner and rolled him onto it. The effort made her muscles scream. Every inch across the wooden floor was one with sweat. The scrape of fabric and flesh seemed deafening, though the night outside was alive with cicadas and frogs, their chorus masking her labors. At the door, she paused, breathless. Her heart pounded so violently she feared it might rouse them, but none stirred. Silas lay unmoving, sunk in his drugged stupor. Step by step, she hauled him into the night. The blanket slid across the dirt, raising a faint trail behind them. She angled toward the wagon, abandoned years earlier at the edge of the yard, its rotting frame cloaked in weeds. There, she dragged him beneath the tarp, hiding the bulk of his body in shadow. She returned for Thomas, lighter, though still a burden. His limbs swung awkwardly, his head bumping against the blanket's edge as she pulled him across the ground. She gritted her teeth, pushing through the ache in her shoulders. Every sound, every creak of the wagon's wood made her freeze, but no lights flared, no voices called out. The quarters were quiet, the big house asleep. Last came Ezekiel, thin and gaunt. His body weighed less, but his presence seemed heavier. Even unconscious, his face carried that unsettling hollowness, as though his soul already walked elsewhere. Penelope shivered but did not falter. She dragged him to the wagon and laid him beside the others. 3 overseers, hidden like livestock awaiting slaughter. The most dangerous task remained. She could not leave the shack as it was. Returning, she carefully reset chairs, wiped the floor where blankets had scraped, and nudged the whiskey bottle back to its original tilt. To a casual eye, nothing seemed amiss. The overseers could have simply staggered out into the night, drunk beyond sense. When she closed the door behind her, her hands trembled, but her mind was cold, steady. The wagon was the staging ground. Beyond it stretched the path to the chosen place, a distant clearing near the forest edge, where a giant fire ant mound rose like a miniature fortress of earth. The enslaved had always avoided it, steering clear of its swarming armies. To Penelope, it was the perfect stage, yet the distance was far, too far to drag 3 men at once. She had to make the journey in stages, hauling each man separately across the fields under cover of darkness. It was an epic task, one that would test her endurance as much as her courage. She began with Ezekiel. Rolling his wiry frame onto her back, she staggered to her feet. The weight bent her forward, her knees nearly buckling, but hatred steadied her spine. Step by step, she carried him across the field, the night air thick with humidity, her breath leaving pale clouds in the dark. Every 100 yards she paused, lowering him gently to the ground, pressing her ear to the silence to ensure no patrol approached. Then she lifted him again, pushing onward. The clearing waited like a secret altar. The ant mound seethed faintly in the starlight, its surface alive with unseen movement. She laid Ezekiel down beside it, his head lolling, his breath rattling. Then she turned back. Thomas was next. His weight was harder, his bulk awkward, but she had found a rhythm now. Lift, carry, pause, listen, continue. Her arms trembled, her back screamed, but she did not stop. The field was vast, yet the fire inside her was larger. By the time she laid him down beside Ezekiel, sweat soaked her dress, and her palms were raw from gripping his shirt. Finally came Silas, the heaviest of all. Twice she stumbled under his mass, her knees driving into the dirt. Each time she forced herself up, dragging him with renewed fury. Hatred was a fuel more potent than strength. When at last she deposited him beside the others, her body shook with exhaustion, but her mind was clear. 3 men sprawled in a triangle around the mound. The arrangement was deliberate, symbolic. 3 demons encircling the pit of judgment. Now came the shovel. She had hidden it days earlier among firewood, waiting for this moment. Its iron blade gleamed dully as she sank it into the earth. The soil was damp, heavy, clinging to the blade, but her arms rose and fell with relentless rhythm. She dug not graves for the dead, but pits for the living. The first hole was for Ezekiel, the grave digger. Sweat poured from her brow, her back aching with each thrust of the shovel. When the pit was deep enough to hold him up to his neck, she dragged him in. Dirt rained down, filling around his torso, pressing him into the earth he had once used to smother others. His head slumped forward, still asleep, the rest of his body entombed. She repeated the process for Thomas, then for Silas. By the time she finished, dawn's first light tinged the horizon. Her hands were blistered, her arms weak, her body coated in mud and sweat. Yet she stood, leaning on the shovel, and looked upon her work. 3 men, buried alive up to their necks, encircled the ant mound like offerings. The potion's hold would not last forever. Soon they would wake to their fate. Penelope stepped back into the grove's shadows, her chest heaving. She was not done, not yet, but for the first time in her life, she felt something close to power. The tormentors were helpless. The stage was set. The sun was rising, and with it, the hour of judgment. The first blade of sunlight split the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold. In the clearing, the 3 overseers appeared, almost grotesque heads protruding from the soil, bodies entombed beneath, their pale faces glistening with sweat as the potion's hold began to falter. The ant mound between them pulsed with life, a dark fortress humming with restless movement. Penelope waited in the shadows of the grove, her breath steady now, her exhaustion replaced by something colder, vigilance. She was no longer the hunted. She was the one who watched, the one who decided. Ezekiel stirred first. His eyes fluttered open, dull confusion clouding them as he tried to move. The realization struck quickly. He was trapped. His shoulders tensed, his neck strained, but the earth held him firm. His lips parted in a low moan that grew into a guttural cry. His gaze darted wildly, taking in the sight of Thomas slumped unconscious to his left and Silas blinking slowly to his right. Then his eyes fixed on the mound. The ants had already begun to stir. Drawn by the vibrations of sound, the heat of breath, they emerged in restless waves. Ezekiel's horror bloomed across his face as he understood. He had buried others alive, consigning them to silence beneath the soil. Now he faced the earth's judgment himself. Penelope stepped forward. She carried a small metal bucket in her hands, the surface glinting faintly in the new Sunday. Ezekiel's cry broke into a whimper, his eyes pleading. She did not speak. She did not need to. Slowly, she tipped the bucket, and the warm liquid inside Chicken's blood gathered before dawn spilled across his head, down his cheeks, into his open mouth. The effect was immediate. The scent carried like a signal flare to the ants. The mound erupted. Thousands poured forth in a living torrent, crawling over one another in frenzied hunger. They swarmed across his face, into his nostrils, his ears, his open eyes. Ezekiel screamed, a raw animal sound that echoed across the clearing. His buried body thrashed beneath the soil, head jerking violently as the swarm consumed him. Within minutes, his features blurred beneath the black-red tide. His cries dwindled to muffled gurgles, then to silence. Justice for the gravedigger was delivered by the very earth he had once wielded as a weapon. The commotion roused Thomas. He woke to horror, eyes wide as he witnessed Ezekiel's final spasms. Vomit spilled down his chin as his body heaved, helpless against the soil's grip. He screamed until his voice cracked, begging, bargaining, offering wealth, secrets, anything. The words poured out in a torrent of desperation. "I'll tell you where the ledgers are. I'll please, mercy." Penelope's face remained still, unreadable. In her hand now was a branding iron, the same tool Thomas had wielded countless times with clinical precision. She had built a small fire before dawn, hidden in the grove, and its tip still glowed red-hot. She approached slowly, the heat shimmering in the air. Thomas sobbed, thrashing uselessly, his head jerking back and forth. Penelope knelt beside him, seizing his hair in a grip far stronger than her frame suggested. She forced his face upward, exposing his brow. His screams turned to shrieks as the iron pressed against his forehead. The sizzle of burning flesh filled the clearing, the acrid stench rising in a choking cloud. When she pulled the iron away, the letter F violator was seared into his skin. Thomas's screams cracked into broken whimpers, his eyes rolling back. But Penelope was not finished. With icy calm, she tilted the still glowing iron, letting droplets of molten metal fall from its tip onto his scalp. Each drop hissed, each drop tore another ragged cry from his throat, until his voice failed and his head slumped to the side, smoke curling from his wound. The brander had been branded, his cruelty etched into his flesh in fire. Now only Silas remained. He had been awake throughout, his pale eyes unblinking, fixed on Penelope. He had watched Ezekiel devoured, Thomas burned, and yet he did not plead. His lips curled in a snarl, spitting curses through clenched teeth. His hatred was as pure as ever, even in helplessness. For a long moment, Penelope studied him. This was the man whose whip had reduced strong men to sobbing wrecks, whose lashes were meant not only to punish, but to perform domination before all. He had believed himself untouchable, eternal, the very embodiment of pain. She turned, walked to the mound, and drove her spade deep into its surface. The earth trembled as the colony surged in agitation. The mound seethed, buzzing louder, until the soil itself seemed alive. Then she lifted the spade, brimming with dirt and hundreds of enraged ants, and poured it over Silas's head. For the first time, fear cracked through his mask. His eyes widened, his breath came in ragged gasps, and at last, a scream tore from his throat. It was not the short scream of surprise, it was the drawn-out howl of a man who knew he faced a torment without end. Penelope did not stop. Shovel after shovel, she poured the living soil over him, burying his head beneath a writhing mass of mandibles and stingers. His screams grew muffled, then ragged, then animalistic. The ants swarmed across his scalp, into his mouth, as he gasped, into the folds of his ears, each bite a needle of fire. But unlike Ezekiel, Silas's death would not come quickly. She gave him no bait, no flood of blood to hasten the swarm. This was endurance, drawn out as long as possible. Hours of agony, every moment a mirror of the pain he had inflicted on others. Penelope sat on a stone nearby, silent, watchful. She did not look away. She bore witness to each gasp, each muffled cry, each twitch of his head as the ants claimed him bite by bite. She did not revel in it, nor did she waver. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was balance, long denied. At last, the sounds faded, the mound over his head stilled. The clearing was quiet once more, save for the morning song of birds. Penelope rose, her body aching, her hands blistered, her dress stained with soil and sweat. Yet her soul felt lighter than it had in years. The three overseers were gone, consumed, branded, buried not by law, not by mercy, but by the same terror they had unleashed upon others. She left the shovel upright in the ground, a silent marker of judgment, and walked away from the field of vengeance. Behind her, the cotton fields stretched endlessly under the rising sun, their neat rows glistening innocently in the light. But the silence hanging over the plantation was no longer fear alone. It was something else, something new. By late afternoon, the plantation tasted wrong, like water drawn from a tainted well. The sun shone as it always did, glazing the cotton with a false serenity, yet every sound rang off-key, the slam of a door too loud, the neigh of a horse too sharp, the bell's clang too hollow. It was as if the place itself sensed that 3 of its pillars had been yanked from the foundation, leaving the whole house listing in invisible wind. At first, the remaining foreman performed a pantomime of confidence. "They'll be back," one muttered, tightening his belt as though leather could stiffen his spine. "Got drunk, slept it off out yonder." Another swore Silas had been seen at dawn near the stables, a lie so thin you could see daylight through it. By evening the swagger was gone. Lamps were lit early, rifles unracked, dogs leashed. The master paced his veranda, a dark figure cutting short lines before the tall white columns, a man who mistook architecture for order. The search began with noise. Hooves pounded the lanes, hounds sniffed fence lines, men shouted names into the hedgerows. They checked the creek bends and ditches, the cane thickets, the old wagon trail, every spot an overseer might stagger to when whiskey ran its final course. The overseer's shack offered only a still life, chairs askew, a bottle knocked half sideways, 3 tin cups with dried rims the color of rust. Nothing that told a story, nothing that could be blamed. Night fell, and the noise became uglier. Lanterns stabbed the dark. The master, who could not locate his missing power, bellowed at those he still could locate. Men and women from the quarters were dragged into the yard by 2s and 3s, faces lit hellish by swinging flames. Questions came like blows. Where did they go? Who saw them last? Who left the shack door open? And when answers were quiet or careful, the questions simply became blows. The lash hissed, fists rose and fell, and the night filled with the grim song that plantation justice always sang when facts were absent. Pain will make truth. But pain, that old informant, brought back nothing new. The quarters answered as one body answers, bowed heads, set jaws, eyes that fixed on the dirt and stayed there. If anyone had seen a shadow move or a door crack or a figure cross the yard, that knowledge dissolved into silence long before it reached the master's ears. Even those who guessed, those who had watched Penelope moving with the concentration of a needle threading a wound, kept their guesses folded and hidden. A pact had formed without words, woven not from conspiracy but from recognition. Some losses are acceptable, some disappearances are mercies. By morning, the search had its formalities. A deputy from town arrived with dust on his boots and suspicion on his face, walked the yard once, squinted at the shack, and found no story there either. He suggested the river. Men get drunk, men fall in, men don't come out. He suggested desertion. There was a warship rumor downriver, or cheap land upriver, or bandits in the bayous who'd hire any man who could shoot straight. The master bristled. His men wouldn't desert, but the deputy shrugged. "Files like these close themselves," he said, and shook the master's hand the way a man shakes free of a nuisance. Days bled into a week, and the plantation tried to put its face back on. Cotton still needed picking, bales still needed weighing. The gin still ate the hours and coughed white lint into the air like ghost breath, but something had shifted in the grammar of the place. Orders were barked with a little less venom, inspections done with a little more distance, hands kept tighter on belts and looser on whips. The remaining foremen discovered a new habit, glancing over their shoulders at open doorways, at the edge of the grove, at the mouth of night. Fear, it turned out, communicated faster than the lash. It seeped through routines, muddying the certainties that cruelty required. If 3 men who delighted in pain could simply vanish, no footprints, no witnesses, then perhaps the world was not as tightly bound as the big house believed. Perhaps the earth itself took note. Perhaps the silence had teeth. In the quarters, work conversations changed timbre. Where once words fell flat and fled, now they grew soft but rooted. Tales budded in the low hours, sprouting leaves of detail, and the name at the tale's center was carefully never spoken. She was the woman, the shadow, the watcher, the avenger, the one who knew plants and patience, the one who could pass through a room without stirring the air. Children were shushed when their eyes went wide and mouths opened. Old women murmured blessings into the seams of conversation and let them hang there like protective charms. A story was being stitched with thread too fine to see yet strong enough to hold. The shape of that story traveled farther than any one voice. It colored how spoons were passed, how doors were closed, how night steps sounded on the packed earth. Men who once laughed loudest at other men's pain found that laughter catching in their throats when a serving girl entered a room. A hand reached for a shoulder and stopped short. A joke unsheathed itself and then slid back into silence, unspent. The legend did not make them kinder. It made them cautious. Sometimes, in history, caution is the first trembling bridge to kindness. Of course, not every ear bent willingly. There were those who muttered that devils had been at work, that the woods southwest of the Jinn held spirits best left unnamed. Superstition always comes cheap in places built on fear, yet even superstition paid tribute to the truth. Something had happened here that pulsed beyond the reach of ledgers and law. The overseer's absence became a seasonal thing like the river rising or the first frost expected and explained yet never settled. Penelope did not glow in this rumor light. She dimmed herself more perfectly than ever. Her steps were measured, her replies minimal, her gaze fixed on its old safe places, floorboards, lintels, the silver lip of a tray. If anyone looked too long in her direction, they found nothing to purchase, no flicker, no tremor, no boast. She was not the hero of a campfire tale. She was its custodian, careful as a librarian with a dangerous book. Still, within her, the balance had shifted. She felt it when she crossed the yard at dawn and the bell rang and nobody met anyone's gaze, when she poured wine and heard the silence at the end of a sentence that once would have turned toward bragging. In a world where every inch of ground had been mapped by cruelty, she had found a square of unmapped night and walked it to its far edge. The map could never be the same. The master tried, for a time, to paste the order back together. He purchased a new whip for a foreman who hadn't asked for one. He ordered the lash count increased for small infractions, as though arithmetic could solve metaphysics. He had the overseer's shack scrubbed and the bottle replaced with a new, gleaming twin. He even hired a preacher for a Sunday to thunder about obedience from the Psalms. But sermons collapse where experience contradicts them. The pew of the quarters was full of people who had seen what happens when tyranny blinks. Soon the veneer cracked in subtler ways. A girl who once would have been slapped for a dropped cup was only scolded. A sick boy sent to the field at sunrise was allowed to lie down at noon. A woman called to the big house after dark found that the summons did not repeat itself. No proclamation marked these shifts. They were tremors, not earthquakes. Enough, however, to tell the body politic that its fever had turned. In the hush between days, the story traveled beyond the property line. Traders carried it half-whispered with their bolts of cloth and sacks of coffee. A ferryman repeated a clean version to a ChatGPT Danoi, and, sold downriver, carried it in his memory like contraband, reciting it to strangers around the fire until it sounded as old as the Psalms themselves. Each retelling added flourishes, trimmed risks, embroidered shadows. Yet the core never shifted. 3 men, crueler than cruelty itself, vanished. A woman, unnamed, unbowed, saw to it. In time, the story became more than an account. It was armor. It wrapped itself around those who bent over cotton rows, those who stirred kettles, those who stared at the night sky dreaming of escape. It whispered, "They are not invincible." It murmured, "Patience can be sharper than the whip." It promised, "Even silence has a breaking point." Thus, while the master fumed at his ledgers and the dogs sniffed endlessly at empty trails, the quarters held a secret more powerful than any iron key. They knew justice had walked briefly in their world, cloaked in shadow, and it had chosen their side. Years rolled forward, and with them the rumble of a nation collapsing under its own contradictions. The plantation, like so many others, carried on its routines cotton-picked, whips cracked, ledgers filled, but the silence left by the vanished overseers never healed. It lingered in the walls of the big house, in the fields at dusk, in the wary glances of men who had once strutted. Then war came. The cannons of the Civil War thundered across the land, tearing open the carefully guarded world of the South. Soldiers marched, bridges burned, fields were trampled under armies that cared nothing for the cotton that once dictated life and death. Rumors of emancipation spread faster than news could be suppressed. For those still bound, every whisper of Union advance was like the faint sound of a key turning in a lock. When Union soldiers finally swept through Louisiana, emancipation was not a ceremony, it was chaos. Plantations emptied in confusion, some masters fleeing, others clinging desperately to their crumbling authority. Chains, literal and figurative, began to break. For Penelope, freedom came like the lifting of a weight she had long since learned to carry without flinching. She left the plantation without ceremony, without farewell. The earth that had swallowed her tormentors would keep its silence, and so would she. But unlike so many who staggered into freedom with nothing but scars, Penelope carried something more, a secret victory and a knowledge she could wield. She did not waste it. She sought out one of the new, precarious communities of free black families forming on the fringes of towns and cities. There, amid the swirl of uncertainty, she built a life not from vengeance, but from healing. Her grandmother's whispers returned to her hands, not as weapons now, but as tools of restoration. Penelope became known as a midwife and healer. Her fingers, once blistered from dragging bodies and shoveling earth, now coaxed life into the world, soothed fevers, eased the pain of childbirth. She gathered herbs not in secrecy, but openly, their power now used to mend instead of to maim. People sought her for remedies, for wisdom, for comfort. She never married. She never bore children of her own. Yet in another sense, she was mother to dozens. Babies she helped deliver grew into free men and women, the first generation in Louisiana to know life without chains. Mothers who had once feared their children would be sold away now looked to Penelope as a guardian of their hope. The years softened her features, though her eyes remained sharp, carrying a depth few dared to question. By the 1,880 seconds, she was a figure of respect, a matriarch of her community, called Miss Penelope, with reverence by those who knew nothing of the fire that had once consumed her. They knew only the healer, the quiet elder whose touch could calm pain and whose presence steadied the frightened. But the story never died. It walked alongside her, whispered still in the shadows of gatherings, embroidered now with the colors of legend. Some said she had commanded spirits of the earth, that the ants themselves were her allies. Others claimed she had slipped through walls, invisible, to strike the overseers down. Children shivered at the tales, but their parents let the stories live, because in them was a truth greater than accuracy. The oppressed are not powerless. Even silence can be sharpened into a blade. Penelope herself never confirmed nor denied, not once, not even on her deathbed. In 1892, she passed quietly in her sleep, an old woman, her face peaceful, her secret intact. She carried to the grave the full truth of that night in 1854, sealing it in silence as perfectly as she had once hidden her hatred. Yet the silence did not erase her. It amplified her. The legend survived, traveled in whispers through generations, reshaped by each retelling but always carrying its core. The overseers' names faded into obscurity, while hers, though seldom spoken, grew larger in absence. She was the avenger, the ghost, the woman who had balanced the scales. The Civil War ended slavery, but it did not end cruelty. Reconstruction staggered. Jim Crow rose like a new overseer draped in law. Yet through it all, stories like Penelope's persisted, dark, defiant reminders that the human spirit can strike back even in the deepest night. For every lash, there is a scar remembered. For every brand, a story told. For every grave dug in cruelty, a whisper of justice waiting to rise. And so the Louisiana earth may have hidden 3 bodies, swallowed whole by fire, ants, and silence, but it could not bury the story. Stories seep into roots and outlast stone. They are carried by wind and tongue, passed like heirlooms no law can confiscate. Penelope became not merely a woman of her time, but a testament across time. Even now, when the cicadas hum in Louisiana summers, when the cotton fields ripple in the heat, her name is not forgotten. It lingers in the hush of dusk, in the memory of those who believe the past is not gone but waiting. She remains a whisper on the wind, a tale of shadows, a justice that came late but came utterly perfect. And that whisper asks, always, what might patience, sharpened by memory, dare to do?